Hi, everybody. I'm your moderator and MC for tonight. I spent 8 years of my career at Quardev, so I feel like I'm giving back because of the community that as Joe said, the community they built starting in the year 2000. So I'm a volunteer, but I'm also selfishly get something out of this every time, and help to pick the speakers and advertise and market the content because it makes us better, these conversations. And tonight, I'm really thrilled to have two longtime colleagues in Michael Larsen and Matt Heusser, author of Software Testing Strategies. So thanks, guys, for signing this. I got a few post-it notes here, and I'm going to load you up because you have opted not there you go, not for slides, although you did give me slides, and you can say, "Hey, John, show slide four." You've opted for the podcast style format, which is more of a chat of different topics. So let's just jump in.
Exciting. Let's go for it.
Instead of saying, "Oh, tell me about you guys," I'm just going to say, like, who do you think you are to think you could write a software testing book?
Ah,
That's the first question.
well, the simple answer is we were asked to. And in fact, we were both asked separately by Pact if we would be interested in writing the book. And when they contacted me, of course, Matt and I, because of the podcast and because of working together, we just have a standing agreement that if any one of us gets something, if a book gets pitched to us or if something happens, we just let the other person know and say, hey, am I stepping on toes, or is it okay if we do this? And so I contacted Matt and I said, hey, Pact Publishing reached out to me about writing a book about software testing. He said, well, that's quite a coincidence because Pact Publishing reached out to me about writing a software book too. And so we just looked and said, chocolate peanut butter goes great together, shall we? And we just asked him, says, what do you think about us both doing it? And they said, oh no, that would be fantastic. Go for it. So Matt can probably fill in some of the others from that, but that's, we thought we could do it because somebody reached out to us and asked us, and we said, hey, why not?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'd say that I'm selfish. So, like, do I want to compete with Michael Larsen, or do I want to collaborate with him? That's a really easy question to answer. But like your question really, I think honestly, you're speaking to our background, and we first met at Star East in 2004. I'm pretty sure it was 2004, so 20 years ago, in May. So we've been working actively in the field. We've both been on the board for the Association for Software Testing. All three of us contributed to the last book, which was about 10 years ago.
Yep.
John wrote a chapter. About 1,000, a little more than 1,000 blog posts I've written. We've done 200 podcasts together. Those podcasts, we interview a broad spectrum of the software testing community. We've done a bunch of conferences and a whole lot of work. My master's degree is in computer science, but computer information systems, but it's really concentrated in quality. I started as a tester because all we had was programmers, and nobody was any good at testing. My first annual review, I said I let too many bugs slip through. My manager said, everybody has bugs. That's not right. That's not a good answer. And so I got into software or testing. And the second thing I'd say is the thing about writing a software testing textbook is they just let you. Anybody can. I mean, your brother wrote one. I mean, anybody can, you know? I mean, joking, I'm joking. But it's not a question of qualifications, I think, as much as can you actually put the work in. And we thought that based on our experiences, we could push the needle forward just a little bit on the knowledge of software testing. I really think we're really proud of what we came up with. So we
And to
wanted to,
add to that, too, one of the nice things about the way that we did this book is that there's a lot of books that talk about testing techniques or testing tools and how to use those tools. And we've got a bit of that in here too. But I will say what's been very interesting is from the feedback that we have received, we have three basic areas. So the first one, the part one of the book, is about developing some testing skills. And they're fairly broad, and we cover a number of areas for that. The second part was about actual software delivery and actual testing in action so that you can do it and put the puzzle pieces necessary together so that you can actually deliver a software product well. And what's been interesting is that the third part of the book is the practicing of politics and the actual nature of the work that we do, and how that's oftentimes fairly ambiguous, sometimes not well understood, and sometimes you got to end up doing things that are mildly unpleasant to downright unpleasant, and dealing with people who don't understand your value or your worth, and having to play in that system. And so we said we would be remiss if we didn't give a little bit of time and talk about those realities. You want to go into testing? Are you sure you want to go into testing? Because here's some stuff you might not have thought about that goes with the job. And
There's a
we felt that was important.
there's a quote in Thomas More's Utopia where he says something like, "First we create criminals and then we punish them." And if, if you've been around long enough, you've probably been in that situation where they hire people that don't have particular skills or experience within a certain low pay grade, and then tell them, and then someone who's never done the job before tells them exactly how to do their job, and the outcome they get isn't very good. And they say, "Oh my gosh, we're not getting a lot of value out of these testers." Well, first we create bad testers and then we punish them. And we think we can do better.
Awesome. Well, one of the questions that I jokingly said that I'd ask you, and it's actually somewhat of a serious question that I hope frames the title of your talk, which is Test Strategy, Approach, Scope, Coverage, Tooling, Measures, Puzzle Pieces, and Politics, which is, I think, Matt, was what you came up with. And that question is, and I'm hoping this question leads to all of that. And it's simply this: if you were a bug in software, where would you hide so that you wouldn't be found? And I'm hoping that'll segue to all the things you want to talk about. So, Michael, I'll go with you first.
Wow. Well, honestly, I think if I'll be a little bit self-serving here because I've actually witnessed this a few times. If I wanted to be a bug and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't found, I would probably associate myself with accessibility and put myself into some form of very large software with organizations that don't care about it. And that's a little flip, but if I want to guarantee I'm not going to get found, people aren't looking a lot of the times for accessibility bugs. And when you bring up the whole idea that, hey, we want to look at this from an area of accessibility, very often that's like, oh, we don't have time for that, or oh, well, that's a lower priority, or they've got much more important things to deal with. And unless, of course, you end up with a very large organization saying, hey, we'd love to buy your software. In fact, we're willing to buy 10,000 seats of it, but we did an audit on your software and we have all these accessibility bugs. And until those are fixed, we can't buy your product. All of a sudden, guess what? You now have a real big problem that needs to be addressed, and it becomes public enemy number one. So I've lived that. So that's why I would say, and I'm saying it half jokingly, but it also comes with the territory of testing, especially if you ever decide you want to get into a very rich area. And if you want to practice a little bit of journalism skills and a little bit of lawyering skills, accessibility is a great area to do that because a lot of people pay lip service to it. They don't really necessarily go into the depths for it. And when organizations have done a good job on accessibility, it shows. And it's a really good thing. But there's so much that can be done and so much low hanging fruit that's just there. So if you but you're asking, like, if you want to be a bug, if you want to be bug, where would you hide? That's where you have to put on the lawyer and the advocate's cap. Because in some cases, for you to find a bug for anybody to care about, you have to explain to them why the situation is dire and it really does matter. Because at some point, every one of us is going to need that particular
Yeah.
amendment to our realities if we live long enough. And we're lucky enough to live long enough. So
Wow.
there you go. There's my answer.
Wow, that's a great answer, Michael. Okay, Matt, tough act to follow, man. But same question.
So, I mean, a couple things there. If we say no one finds me, then does it matter? Like, so I'm going to try to find a category of defect that does matter, but might slip through. So that'd probably be like a financial transaction that calculates interest or something. That kind like we usually don't get a calculator out and calculate the interest on our statements every month. What was the average daily balance times 0.05 divided by 12 times? We don't do that. So it would be some kind of calculation that is a logical consequence of the interplay between two different requirements. So for car insurance, which is in the book, you have we're going to give you this discount if you pay in full for the year, and we're going to give you this discount if you're a student, but we're going to charge you this much more if you're so old or that much. What if you're a really old student, right? Which is not going to happen much. And then we're going to introduce exchange. So a programmer will do something like cut and paste some code to support the first change because there's a Boolean. It's just going to add a parameter, put an if statement in there and cut and paste the code in two halves and make one change. Then we're going to introduce another change. It's going to change the top but not the bottom. So it's going to be some rare combination of things that he's got an if statement too. And no one is going to notice until all of a sudden someone bursts in the room and says, I think we've been calculating this dollar amount wrong for the past 10 years, and we're going to have to go back and restate earnings and recalculate and give people their money back. I think that's what you're getting at. And that's
Yeah,
how you get there.
it's because testing is visibility. It's finding, not fixing, not killing bugs. Development and business get together to decide. It's discovery. And if you're at a moral imperative to exist as a bug and you wanted to hide in a place where you typically or have a good chance of not being found, that's the spirit that gets to, okay, then how can we find a better class of things in a more diverse way? And that gets into approach and scope and coverage. So great answer, Matt. So what, given there's so much in the title that you have to offer, is there anything that's off the top of your mind, like the one thing or the top three things that you want people to take away from what you've written, this kind of compendium of a diverse set of issues in testing, that is you're most excited to talk about, or the biggest impression you want to leave people with?
I have a little exercise that we could talk about first that I think,
Cool.
can we bring up slide 3, activity or role?
Let's do slide 3. I will share my screen. 1, 2, 3. Then I'll do Shift F5.
So there's a great book called by Eli Goldratt called The Goal. It's a novel. If you read novels for fun, you might actually enjoy it. And one of the examples he gives, he's simulating a factory. We have software we wrote to do this. And it's I think there's a link on there for, there's a GitHub for it, which of course is hard to read, but we can cut and paste it and put it in the chat. But so imagine a factory has different workstations. Your factory has, if you roll a 6-sided die 1,000,000 times, you're gonna get an average that's like 3.5 million, because it's gonna the 1 and the 6 average out to 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. The 2 and the 5, the 3 and the 4. It's gonna be 3.5 is your average on dice. So you roll one 6-sided die to figure out how many matchsticks you move through your workstation per day. And every day you just roll the dice however many times. 5 workstations, you roll the dice 5 times. But a 6-sided die has high variability. It's average number, but it's high variability. So if you have 5 steps in your process and you have completely average throughput but high variability, bottlenecks will occur naturally. The first person is going to roll a 6, but the next person is going to roll 2 2s in a row or whatever, and all of a sudden 2 6s, 2 2s, 12 come in, only 4 go out. There's a bunch of max sticks are going to build up at that workstation. So what that means is that delivery is going to be constrained. You're going to go slower. The more workstations you add, the more opportunities there is for a bottleneck to come up, the slower you're going to go. And that's what the simulation does. How many workstations do you want? How many times do you want to run it? This is the number you get. And it's going to be lower the more workstations you add. Why am I talking about that? Because if we view testing as a separate and distinct role, mathematically, unless you have a way to completely reduce variation, you're going to go slower. It's just math. Reducing variation would be like a developer tester pair where you've completely balanced it and you never stop. You just continuously flow. Short of that, if you have a tester who's going to work over here. Give me a build. I'll go test it. You're going to slow things down. If that's true, then the fruity DevOps, platform engineering, continuous everything people would say, well, we just need to get rid of the testing role. We've said, or testing can be so valuable and the throughput reduction can be so minimal that it more than pays for itself. It doesn't matter. You do it anyway. Just as you do with graphic design, just as you do with requirements or product ownership or whatever you call that process of figuring out what we're going to build. But we need to be incredibly valuable. And to do that, we want to make our work transparent. We want to make it visible. We want to make it so obvious that if someone says, we want to get rid of testing, everyone looks at them funny and says, you spend a week here first, right? I know you're new VP and you got great ideas. Spend a week here first. What you've seen might be different than what you saw everywhere else. So I think that's sort of the framing of what we're going to try to talk about. I think it's an incredibly high bar. I think we met it, but really that's up to you folks to decide.
What's the relationship between delay and value then? If delay is necessary because of critical distance, like the writer-editor relationship, but so is value in finding a diverse set of issues and risks, then what are you suggesting about the need for the role in the critical distance versus the inherent delay that it causes?
Well, you got to be good at it. So when people talk test is dead conversation, there's a pretty good Star West conversation by Mr. Whitaker that from 10 years now, 2011. It's out on YouTube. And he describes this sort of test case. We all the test cases, we run the test cases, we get the results. And I see resumes like this. Our job is to design test cases and execute them, kind of thinking. And he describes a bunch of kind of not very high value added activities. And then he says, this doesn't add a lot of value. We should get rid of it. So yeah, we agree. And that doesn't add a lot of value. That doesn't really relate at all to the way we do things. So the social distance, the value, if the value pays for itself, the social distance doesn't matter. If it doesn't, then all it is delay, or it's delay plus some obvious things. Well, turns out really good test infected XP type developers can find the obvious things.
And that's also part of what we were looking at when we talked about what goes into our test strategy and how you communicate that. And we said pretty clearly that we felt that test cases were probably, I won't say of no value, but of fairly low value in the properties of what we were talking about. Having the skill set necessary to be able to run a variety of tests, exploration, being able to do automation if that's something that's important for the process, having communications with the development team early on. In fact, John, I frequently call this up because I think you're the one, and I hope I'm giving the right credit because I borrowed it from you. But one of the things I love doing and I love talking about, and I've mentioned this for years now, is I love getting involved in those very early strategy meetings and talking to people about what's going in, what the feature is. And the phrase I borrowed from you is provoking the requirements to where you're actually getting in the faces of the developers and saying, hey, you're saying that we're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z here. How are we going to approach that? What are the things that we need to make sure of? Have you discussed the testability mechanisms necessary? Is this something that's going to be easily hookable, if you will, with an API or some other way? Is it going to be something that's going to require database manipulations to be able to be effective? Does it have any possible areas to where it might be vulnerable? Have you given any consideration to security aspects? Are you embedding this? Is it a microservice? Is it something that you have to call from another page someplace else? Do you have anything that could potentially be a man in the middle that this has to communicate with, and you need to do something about. Oftentimes when you're discussing these, if you're not there as the tester early on to have those conversations with them, there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of implicit knowledge that just goes into, oh yeah, we've thought about all this. We know what we're doing with this. And every once in a while, it just takes one of me to come in and ask an obnoxious question and derail the conversation. It's like, oh, wow, you know what? That's a very good point. We hadn't considered that. You're right. This is a microservice because it's a microservice and it exists over here. Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we have these areas thought out. Or if there's a third party API that we're working with, we need to make sure that we're up to date with it and that it's documented well. Those are all good points. Yeah, I would argue that if you have those conversations early on and you're able to shape that and have that level of advocacy for what your product needs to be and for who's going to be able to use it. And yeah, I would also make a case that early on, I would say, are we discussing things like the usability of the product, the accessibility of the product, the responsive design of the product, the performance of the product? What are all the things that we should be addressing here? And if you get a chance to have that conversation that early in, and it moves the needle considerably, yeah, I would say that you as a tester have saved that company a lot of money and justified your purpose for being there.
You know, one thing that I think might be useful at this point, and we mentioned it a couple times in the book, we like, what do people get out of test cases? Why are they doing them? Who thinks they're good? And it turns out different roles have different views of them, right? So a project manager might want a stable, predictable, repeatable process. Management wants that too, but it's more like, how can we swap people out at any given time and just give them something to do and not have this risk that expertise walks out the door? And then testers just want to know what to do all day. And then some people value that. We think there's a documentation element that's important. Hidden inside of that big click this, click that, type this, type that is directions. One of the companies I worked with, they turned their test case management system off and nobody noticed. But it's not quite true. Several times over the next 6 months while I was there, someone would say, how do you create an account with a specialty code where they don't have sales tax because they're a nonprofit? How do you set that up? What I want, like, can we just run an insert statement into the database that creates one of those for me and returns the ID number and I can just key off that for my test? Nobody remembered because it was written somewhere in a test case. We call that a recipe. And we think that it's important. So we want to get some idea of coverage. How well have we tested the application? We want to get some idea of those interesting little fiddly bit training and documentation scenarios. Once you have those two pieces together, and there's a few more, but any competent person can take over and figure out what to do. And it's
a couple of questions have popped in on this, and
Yeah.
since it dovetails right into what we're talking about
It
here,
does.
I think there's
just
some.
gonna say, if I may, Michael, let me tee it
Go
up for
ahead.
you. Because I was
Go
thinking
ahead.
the same thing as John Creason, who puts in the chat. How do we find teams who are interested in this level of provocation? Because Michael, you mentioned obnoxious. You mentioned provocation, and I did too.
Yeah.
And then Matt, you're mentioning value though. So how do you fight fatigue, especially in the development mindset, where they just want to create, and the business people want to ship, and the legal people want to make sure things are buttoned up, and the tester is like, well, wait, I have like a million questions for you, as you aptly, Michael, pointed out, not only about accessibility but all kinds of other illities.
So yeah, happy to talk about this. So there's a couple little factors here. How do you find teams that are interested in that level? The first thing is that you insert yourself. And you show that by doing it, there's value to those conversations. And it might be off-putting for some people first. And again, I'm either fortunate or unfortunate, depends on how you want to look at this. I have a little bit of a self-deprecating sense of humor, but people know that when I start doing those, or when I start making, poking fun at myself about something, or I make a little joke about myself, people who are there might be put at ease by that. Oh, that's kind of funny. People who know me, though, know what's coming. because they know that as soon as I have skewered my own sacred cows, it's open season on what yours are. And by doing that, that's one thing that helps. So I admit that there's areas that we didn't do very well here. Or you remember the last time that we had put this out or we had talked about this problem, we didn't really address it. And yeah, we got stung by that. I confess, I got stung and it was something that we missed. And I feel really bad about that. You know what? I would like to not get stung like that again. So having had that experience, once bitten, twice shy, I don't want to go through that again. Yes, I'm going to be early on and I'm going to be discussing these things, not because I want to be a jerk about this, but because I don't want us to have that experience again. More times than not, when a company has had a bite that has been significant or severe, they tend to appreciate you coming in and doing it. You can't come in and just say everything sucks and we're going to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater and you're going to do what I say because I'm somebody special. That doesn't go over very well. People don't like their egos being bruised, and it tends to upset people. So if you go in with that as the idea, don't be surprised you don't make a lot of friends. And a lot of people don't want to listen to what you have to say. But if you go in with the idea of, hey, you know what? I've been through this a few times and here's a couple projects I worked on. And, this is interesting that we have this challenge. I'd like to maybe suggest a few things if it's okay. And then you start from there. Now you're not talking about this from the perspective of, oh, this is awful and I did a terrible job, or I'm expecting that the company is going to do a terrible job. Excuse me. I'm saying I know that this can be a struggle.
Yeah.
And because I know that this can be a struggle, I think that maybe we can come with a meeting of the minds and this can be of value to all of us.
Good.
At
All
least
right.
I found that to be the case.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, is slide 8 about coverage a
Yep.
pivot, or is it on
I think
on
it's on
track with
topic.
Michael?
I think it's my way of answering your question about how do we provoke or how do we find a team that's interested. I would suggest one thing. So testers, generally speaking, or you could be just a developer that cares about testing, as I was for the first decade or so of my career. They have a broader perspective because it's easier to test stuff than to write it. So you tend to look at the system as a system to see where the things fall apart because of that problem I mentioned earlier, where the intersection of requirements causes the defect, or the subsystems, or the new version of Firefox, or whatever it is that you're doing. New version of iOS breaks it, so you've got to test the whole thing under that. So one thing that I've had some success with is creating a coverage model that is, these are all of the pieces. And in this slide, the upper right and the lower right are both coverage models. Lower right's just stuff on a whiteboard. Upper right is an app is called MindMeister. I think it's free until you want to share things past 2 or 3 people, or you want to have more than a couple of images. So, and you can just draw all the different pieces of the app and do a mind map. And nowadays, you can just send people a link. Hey, come look at it, and you can edit it in real time like you would a Google Doc. And you're being successful. Years ago, the first time I did one of these, I shared it with my project manager. I started going meetings, and people would say, "Have you seen that image that Tessa put together?" And I was like, what? Oh, that one? Yeah, I've seen that one. Yep. Because I mean, she had more influence than I did in the organization. She was talking to higher level leaders, and she took what I'd drawn, took an image, dumped it into a document to describe what the heck the system was doing, and all people had were words. So if we model the coverage of the model the application and all the different things, it can be difficult because some of the most interesting bugs are actually cross-feature. So you may actually have some very complex scenarios in there as their own high-level bullet. Ideally, like getting to the whole puzzle pieces that we're talking about before, every one of those can be a link that then goes to a wiki page that has the recipe for that feature. Or maybe there's a query for all the bugs that are open on that feature. There's lots of things you can do with that. But you just share it with the world. Next thing we can do is, who's testing what components and how deeply are they testing them? We did this with the automotive manufacturer for their mobile app. And the answer was, we don't know. That feature was built by a contract team which no longer exists. So well, who's responsible for this? Who's maintaining this? We don't know. Now they had 16 teams on 3 continents, not a huge surprise. But why were we in there? Well, we were in there because of product rescue, because the quality was low on the app. What do you mean the quality is low on the app? I mean, the scores in the Apple Store are low. And it's a problem compared to our competition. So that's a relatively objective measurement that is a qualitative measurement, right? I think I said that right. So so one thing you can do is create the mind map and start having the conversations. And then start taking responsibility for components no one will take responsibility for. Pretty soon, you're running testing. Then, when we find defects, we can convert that into sort of a human qualitative explanation of the status of the software and have a conversation. Is that good enough? So visibility, transparency, that upper left-hand corner is red, yellow, green even. Just here's where we're at. Is that okay? Help me understand. Help me understand how good is good enough. And you may get pushback. You may get, it's good enough, fine, I don't care, leave me alone. Just do your job, fine. Sooner or later, though, in my experience, when you have these strong emotional, I'm not happy with the quality of the software, I'm not good putting it out like this, but I sent the email and got the email response. The customers are going to tell you. And then someone's going to come back in and say, you're going to have quality emergency. And all of a sudden, these little breadcrumbs you've been putting, people start picking your breadcrumbs up. Tell me more. We got to do this thing. And as long as you don't care about the credit, as long as you can be in the meeting when they say, we have to start using Bob's coverage matrix. And you, Bob's, well, I don't care because my goal is to get things done. As long as you can do that, you can actually start to influence change. That's what I would say. Like, how can I find the team that really cares about this stuff that's doing awesome? How do I deal with the malaise that I find in typical corporate life? That's the
Yeah,
question I chose to
I,
answer.
I think that's the right question. As Bailey offers in the chat, this question about that bottleneck and developers doing all the testing, which and the allusion you made earlier to James Whitaker's talk about testing is dead with Alberto Saviola and those. I think it was at
Well,
Google.
that was a
Google
GTAC. I'm talking about the Star West, but yeah, it's
Oh, the
very
Star Wars.
similar content. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on developers doing all the testing? Bailey asked, with some help from testers or not when needed.
So from my perspective, and we make this very clear, that, and you saw on the slide, is testing an activity? Is testing a role? Who does testing? I know ideally, everybody should be actively involved with, passionate about, and interested in testing. Simple fact is, at least historically, when it's come to development, a lot of developers aren't real passionate about doing the extra level of testing that goes with it. Some are. And I want to be very clear here. There are many people who say, oh, well, developers don't know how to test. That's not true. There are a number of developers who are very good at testing. In fact, some developers are so good at testing, they decided that testing was more fun than writing code. And so they shifted their attention over towards doing testing. And again, we can also look at that from the perspective of a lot of people think about, testing. Well, are you do you write automation? And that's, to some people, that's the extent of their testing knowledge, or the testing that matters is if you don't write automation, or if you're not actively involved in writing automation, therefore you must not be a very good tester. And that's rubbish. It is. And I tell people, I teach courses on doing automation. In fact, past several months, that was exactly what I was doing. I was doing an upskill course where I was teaching people how to use C# and Playwright to pretty decent effect, gave them an application to go loose on and demonstrate to their higher ups at the company they worked for, and they were quite impressed with it. Fantastic. Do I want to write automation all day long? The answer is no, I don't. That's my personal thing. I'm not saying that I'm not willing to write automation. I'm not saying I'm not willing to get into it, but a lot of what automation is it's the known stuff that we've blocked out. And in some ways you could say it's the hard coded absolute recipe, at least for that particular dish, if you will.
Yeah.
And some people are very motivated. I'll use the recipes example for this again, because it's a lot of what we talk about. Instead of having very hammered out deliberate test cases, and I will oftentimes say, if I'm talking about, because I'm somebody who loves to cook, and when it comes to recipes, I use recipes as guidelines, frankly, because oftentimes you might see somebody who will say, I need to make sure this works, and they follow the recipe to the letter. They don't know why. They don't know what the purpose is. Have you ever noticed that if you cook up 100 different dishes, you sure do seem to cut up an awful lot of onions. You seem to cut up an awful lot of celery. You seem to cut up an awful lot of carrots. They show up in a whole bunch of stuff. Now, an uncurious chef or cook, if you will, would just go, oh, this requires onions. Oh, this requires carrots. Oh, this requires celery. I guess I got to chop them up and use them. And they never stop to think, what are those? Well, it's a mirepoix if you're interested in French cooking. They're aromatics. They add a nasality to the food that you eat. Now, if you understand aromatics, now you can take in a whole bunch of things. You can substitute things. You can, instead of having it be a French style dish, you can put in ginger and now you've got an Asian style dish, or you can put in green peppers and now you've got a Cajun style. But you don't know that if you haven't taken that next step. So recipes are a good starting point. But if you only live by the recipes, then you're missing a lot. But it does indeed contain important information. And then automation, I would argue, that's the recipe that's always followed. Yeah. The testing is getting into the flavor profiles and having some fun with it.
Right. I started cooking recently, and I don't like onions, so I left onions out of the recipes. And my wife and daughter were like, "That's all right, Dad." And I'm like, "Well, I didn't put the onions in. I didn't put." And they're like, "Can you just do it?" And I'm like, so I started adding them in like the recipe said, and you're right, it made a difference. It really made it more tasty, and the chemistry in the pan just was different. So I learned, like, okay, that you're right. They add something, and but I could only find out by doing it. So Joey Schaefer, I'd like to throw to you. You've got a question that you'd like to ask in person. So.
Yeah, thanks. I've got, well, this question has a little bit of a background to it, but first of all, I was going to say congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I worked for one of those companies that got rid of testers about, 4 years ago now? And I was managing testers. So I sat around and twiddled my thumbs for a while, and then managed to get them to move me into a developer role. And I did that for a couple of years. I wasn't particularly good at it. What I'm best at is actually managing people. So now I'm managing developers at this company. And it's actually quite a bit easier than managing testers, mostly because of the politics. No longer second-class citizen, don't have to worry about all the, everything rolling downhill. It's kind of interesting. And I say we got rid of all the testers. We got rid of the back end testers. I think they wanted to get rid of all the testers at the time, but then they realized we had so much lead time for our mobile apps that they really couldn't just send them out without good testing. So we do have a team of front end testers. And luckily my back end development team has a lot of people that used to be testers on it. So we still get fairly good testing. But the question I have is, I am managing this working group or facilitating this working group. So a couple of years ago, they decided to get rid of our test environment as well. They got rid of all the testers first, then they got rid of our test environment. So we basically have a dev environment. You can do, your local stack, you can do all your testing, and then you run it to production and and hope it'll deploy to production, run the test, and if the tests don't pass, it'll automatically roll back. It's like the continuous deployment thing. It's not as much of a disaster as I thought it would be. But it did take them a very, very long time to actually get all the teams off of the test environment. But now we have new management, which luckily is a little more sane than our previous management. And so I'm in charge of this working group to see whether or not we should bring our test environment back. And for quite a few teams are doing just fine without it. They've got lots of test cases that they've written. They just have a services that are pretty basic. We still get some manual testing if you've got mobile apps, and they're fine. But for services like pipelines and things that have a ton of dependencies, they're really struggling with or services that do a lot of database stuff are really struggling without having an environment where they can actually do that. Not to mention, you can't, how do you do performance testing? How do you do, there's a number of things you can come up with. I'm wondering if maybe anybody in the audience, or if you guys have heard of this, is anybody else doing this? Like delivering software without an actual test environment? And if so, how do you do it? Or what are the best practices around that?
So I can actually answer this. And interestingly enough, Matt and I both have familiarity with this because I'm going to be talking about the same company. It was the company that I worked with for a number of years up until just recently. And I said, I'm going to use the name that we knew it as. It got merged into a couple of other companies. So I'm going to talk about social text. And social text is an interesting example of this because social text has done pretty much all of these things. We had a pretty robust pipeline that we developed and a lot of automated tests that we did. And the developers were actively engaged in testing with us. And we had a actual test team that focused on a broad array of things. We had developers that practiced test-driven development and that were fond of the practice. And when I say that we had some of the most brilliant developers in the world working for our team at the time, that's not an exaggeration. And the great thing was the most brilliant developer on our team was very test aware and very pro-test, for the testing and helping us do what we needed to do. Honestly, I am incredibly grateful that I got a chance to work with Audrey Tang. I learned a tremendous amount from her. But what I also learned from her was the fact that you didn't necessarily have to go through all of the standards. You didn't necessarily have to have the development environment and then push to staging and then push to production and have this stepped level. As your features become more finely tuned and smaller, and especially if you're doing things like multiple deployments per day, which if you're dealing with software that has a long lead time and there's a lot of features that are going in, you probably don't want to push that to production because it's a lot of things that could potentially break and you could cause a world of pain for people. But if you're working on one thing at a time and a little granule is being pushed to the site, and if you notice that something's wrong, you can either turn it back pretty quickly, or you can work with it, or you can monitor it or tweak it while it's on the site itself, then that's easier to deal with. And so what we ended up doing was we developed our pipeline over time, and we had a lot of tests that we used to help us do this. And each set of tests would define where we went next in the environment. And we also had tests that we ran after we deployed on the production environment that we ran kind of low key, but they were more like monitoring. They were more just saying, hey, is everything in place? Did you get these things put in correctly? And then we would have little agents that would run just to collect information for us and say, is the feature that we just pushed, do people see it? Are they interacting with it? Has it actually done something? If an error has been generated, have we got that? So there are benefits to being able to do this. And so to say, oh, we're testing in production as though that's a big joke and it's a laugh, ha, 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 what idiot would do that? And I would say, no. There are a lot of good cases to where doing your development work, perhaps staging it in an environment where you can see that everything's playing with each other, because it's unlikely that a developer is going to have every tool at your disposal, or they're going to have a database that's been replicated 4 or 6 times. That's where a staging environment is valuable, and you
Yeah,
want
the biggest issue is the integration
Yeah.
testing.
And so that was that. So those were the ways that we were able to work with it. And so we had multiple little steps that we could take. And depending upon what we were doing, if it was a big deal, yeah, we spent more time on it. We spent more upfront testing. And as we were discovering different areas and we thought, hey, this would be a good thing for us to pipe into automation, definitely. We want to make sure that we add this to our step. We want to split it out now so that we can run our tests in parallel, and we want to make it so that instead of it taking half a day, we can run our tests in 20 minutes. That's a big deal. And then by having that continuous opportunity to push during the course of the day, when you're only dealing with one feature that you've got to deal with and it's relatively small, the risk to that goes way down.
Yeah,
If you've got a whole
like
bunch of things,
200 services that all interact with each other. It's, I mean, it's a big,
I'd like to speak to that for a minute if I might.
and
go for it.
performance testing is also an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, so continuous deployment as we know it, continuous delivery, for a large part that came out of some work done by the CTO of IMVU, which, as we recall, was a chat-based online world, and he then went to Etsy. And Pete Whalen and I went up there and interviewed them. There's an article, it's 10 years old, called Continuous Deployment Done in Unique Fashion at Etsy. The thing about Etsy was they were a PHP shop. So we'd have a single file that is all of the code for a single web page and all the logical interactions you would do in that web page. Now, as long as you weren't changing the database, you could just redeploy that file. It would recompile on the fly, and you could do all that you wanted. They didn't have inter-process communication. They didn't have a lot of the concept of the server was kind of abstracted from them. They just just changed PHP code and ran it. Like, they were starting to get unit tests or trying to enforce a unit testing culture, starting to build up. They were starting to build up a test team around the time that we came in and interviewed them. I think the day we were there, it was like 11 or 12 o'clock. They probably had 80 people in the building. They probably had close to that many production deploys for the day at that point. So you could go make your change, go to the wall of data and look for a spike in 404s. And if you saw that, you go back to your desk and you fix it. And then they added an exploratory testing layer. They added a beta layer. But basically, like, they had a very particular architecture which enabled this kind of work. If you wanted to make a change to the database, those went out on Tuesdays. Those had a process. If you touched money, credit card transactions, PCI governance, that had a different process. If you touched personal information, that had a different process. When they said you make changes to production on day one, what they meant was they had a 3-ring binder with paper that was laminated that told you how to change the About Us page to add your picture. So the only thing you could screw up was that you could screw up that little table that had everybody's picture and name. That was the most damage you could do on day one when you made your changes to production. Now, most of us would have edited some kind of content management system, but they did theirs in code, which is fine. And their claim was true, but it wasn't what the executives heard when they heard changes in production on day one. And the architecture context was completely lost when we said, oh yeah, we're just going to do continuous deployment. We're not going to have a staging server. So, like, I think it would be great to have a roundtable discussion on that. But the short answer is, it sounds like your context is different than the kind of context that was created when continuous deployment was invented. So I would have the same concerns you do. We probably could come up with a half dozen cheap hacks to make it work, but I would find that unsatisfactory. And if I can, I want to go back to the no testers thing for a minute, if it's all right.
Yeah.
Lots of companies have done it and gotten away with it. I would argue, if your motivation is to get rid of testing because you think it's testers as a role, you think it's dead weight. the average testing skill on the whole team needs to go up. So you have to find a way to train everybody and get them upskilled. And so you usually find there are people that are members of the technical staff that are kind of skilled or specialized. Maybe they write code sometimes, but they do a lot of testing. So there are these kind of hybrid roles that pop in or pop out, or coaching roles, or that sort of thing. I'm reminded of our friend Jesse Alford, who was a tester at Pivotal Labs, and one of the VPs was given one of these context-free discussions that at a conference that simplified a very complex topic down to we ain't got no testers. And Jesse raised his hand and was like, I work at Pivotal Labs. I'm in building number 3 and I'm a tester. Like, maybe we shouldn't be making these claims. There's usually more context there. And if we simplify it in one sentence, we get in trouble.
I think
That's our approach. I just covered the approach. Oh,
yeah,
the other part of our approach is that we start with where we are and we build out. So it's like wherever you are now, make a context map. Wherever you are now, create those recipes and start building that up. You can do that on your lunch hour. And then you can step back and say what needs to change. Instead of here's how you should do everything from now on going forward without ever talking to you or examining you or having any context. That's our approach.
I brought up this slide, Matt, because it was important to you to pivot to tooling and automation, which I think Joey's question set you up nicely for that.
We got a lot of questions about it in the
yeah, in the chat, and maybe it's so popular thread, a set of threads in our business. Did you want to hit something specific as you
I could just do like a couple minute riff on this because I think it's really important.
Okay.
So when people say, if you Google software testing, how do I do it? Software test automation, how do I do it? You get 2 answers. You get unit tests and test-driven development, which we could go into, and you get kind of like poking the GUI and making it do stuff. And the poking the GUI and making it do stuff is usually pre-recorded steps up front. Click, 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 type, click, expect the number 7 in the bottom right-hand corner, right? If you're lucky, bottom right-hand corner. It might just be the number 7 appears on the page somewhere. So the first time you run that test, it's not going to work because it's all buggy and you're going to fix it, which you'd have to do if you were doing it as a human being anyway. Then it works. And then it adds no real value until it finds a problem. So on the right-hand side, we have one of Doug Hoffman graciously gave us permission to reuse his material. You could imagine it as testing as a grid, as XY coordinate grid. And the defects are mines, or maybe in his example, it's dog doo-doo, right? You take a walk. Well, once you've cleaned it up, running the same tests over and over again is gonna have limited value. So once a test is institutionalized as this thing we run exactly the same all the time, it's not a test anymore. It's just change detection. And what do programmers do? They create change. Well, it's like, hey, there's a change. Okay, well, is that good or bad? I don't know. We got to run it again. We got to debug it. It turns out, what changed? The thing that you were supposed to change this sprint changed. Okay, so we got a maintenance burden and a debugging burden. The other thing is how deep do you go? So there's two broad possibilities. One is we type these things, this should appear on the page. It does. The other one is the page should look exactly like this. And both of those are problems because the first one's going to miss. At the end of any test case, there's a hidden assertion. Nothing weird happened. And the first one's going to miss all those. And the second one, I've got a animated GIF somewhere of a recording where it would flash a weird error message and then it would work. Right? The second one, if you change anything on the page, it's going to give you an error. So then you've got to make your software smart enough to go in the middle. In the book, we talk about some ways to do that. You can introduce randomization. You can take random walks. You can do model-driven testing. You can try to be very smart about what pieces you inspect. You can have it catalog all of the errors and have a human log in and use visual testing to say, this is okay, this isn't, this is okay, this isn't. But there's an entire layer of problems companies get into when they say, we're just going to automate all the testing, which is just an incredibly naive thing to do. And our hope with that chapter is that you can slog through it yourself and learn it in 3 years if you're paying attention. Some people don't; they just change jobs every 3 years, or read the chapter. So that's my 7-minute introduction to those ideas. I think it's worth mentioning.
Cool. All right. Well,
That's my rant. Sorry, but I think it addresses some of those questions. I really wanted to get them answered.
great. Well, we're almost at time. I'd like you guys to leave the audience with something meaningful to take away. I think we can share out the slides as a link, but is there something that you want to leave everybody with, either about the book or about the principles, or your favorite or your most important principle in the book? I'll start with you, Michael, first.
Sure. So one of the chapters that I think, and it's interesting because it's been a chapter that I've been asked to talk about a few times now, and it's come to be something that I think a lot of people are interested in, is the puzzle pieces of good testing. And the fact that that's exactly what we're doing. We're assembling things, knowing how a recipe, for our example, what to set up and how to find where the bodies are buried, basically, is important. You need to know how to do that. You need to be able to know what you are getting into, what challenges you're facing, what areas are new, what areas are fresh, what areas are undiscovered, and what areas are kind of rote and that you're just looking for regressions for to see if there's anything that's the matter with it. And the one area that I think that, what is it that testers can do that, say, AI can't do or isn't doing? That is persuasion. That's the thing I think that testers still have on their side right now. Now, I don't know if it's going to always be that way, but if we make a good point, like if we're developing a good test strategy and we've put it together and we're helping get this information out into the market in a good way, and we are showing that we are paying close attention to our challenges, our problems, we're addressing the areas that matter to our stakeholders, and also we are able to persuade with our level of advocacy that certain areas are important and that they should matter to the team, that is going to go a fair distance. AI will only run what you tell it to, honestly, and it might say, well, here's a bunch of areas you might want to consider. But is AI going to convince you? Is AI going to actually sit you down and say, no, look? And please understand, I am not saying this to have any disparagement against. I think AI can do some interesting and neat things, but it's dangerous to just turn everything over and say, AI will take care of it, problem solved, I don't have to worry about this. I disagree. I think that the best benefit that we have is our own humanity, our own advocacy, because we actually care about people and what they're doing. I oftentimes come back to accessibility. It's kind of my wheelhouse, and I love mentioning it. I love mentioning it because it's very people specific. You could create the most reliant, compliant product out there. It meets every single possible thing, right? But the problem is that yes, you can check all the things, that all the requirements, and it can be a terrible product for your customers to use. It's compliant, but it's an awful experience. Now, how do you get that across to people? You get that across by being able to persuade them. And you persuade them by the fact that you've gone in the trenches, you've actually done the homework, you've communicated with people about what to do, and you're communicating your progress along the way. So we didn't talk much about dashboards, but a dashboard is an example of, and it can be as simple as a whiteboard with sticky notes, or you can put a computer monitor on the wall. At one of the organizations I worked at, we actually had that. We had a big screen TV that ran our test builds, our pipeline things, and you saw the tests, and you saw when it was green and you saw when it was red. And if you wanted to, you could walk over and you could expand and you could see what was red and why. It communicated, it told people what was going on. And by virtue of that, and by virtue of them being able to see what was happening and how it was happening, product was doing. And if you're there able to advocate for why something should be done, and you're able to demonstrate that you're either going the right direction or you're not going the right direction, that has impact. And as long as you have that human touch and you're willing to push with that, I dare say if an organization is willing to let you do it, because right now it feels like a lot of organizations are on the, hey, we've got AI to do this. We don't need people. I'm cautiously optimistic to say, give it time. I have a feeling that this too shall pass, and they may decide that people are important after all.
Wow,
That's
that's pretty powerful. Yeah, I'll put this in chat. Speaking of persuasion, because it was so potent and germane to what you're saying. I found this the other day. Someone told me about it on, I think, a Discord server. It's a colorblind simulator. It made me
Yes.
colorblind, and it was like, wow, this UI sucks in that respect.
Yes.
Instantly persuasive, and it's just one of those. So excellent point about persuasion. That's one of our superpowers as testers. So Matt, same question. What do you want to leave us with, either about the book or one of the more potent things that you discuss in the book?
Well, I'll try. So you can go to pack. So the book is $50. Get it on Amazon if you want. You can get you want to pay that, pay 40, get the Kindle version. You don't want to pay that, go to pack.com and you can get the ebook cheaper than that. You don't want to pay that. In 24 hours, maybe less, we're going to have a discount code of STS25 set up. That'll get you 25% off the book at pack.com, any edition, the ebook or physical book. And that's like, it's a pretty deep discount. And I have, AI, Michael and I are planning on giving a talk in the Pacific Northwest on AI and testing in the fall. And that should be announced the next couple of weeks. I can't quite get the details out on that yet. And overall, the strategy.
You might want to talk to their marketing director. Oh, wait.
Well, yeah, right. I think we can figure that out. Let's get that up. But overall, the strategy we use in the book, I think is meaningful, is let's make what we do transparent. Let's visualize it. Let's get it out there so people can see it. Let's create a risk list. We make a risk list, right? So we make a risk list. We publish it. It's a Google Doc. Anybody can come to it. There's a priority. You can change a priority and shift it. And we say, we're going to be able to go this far down this week, or we generally go this far down when we do our testing. And in this particular category, right? So we're making this change to the whole system. Okay, we're just going to breathe on the reports because we don't think reports should be impacted, right? No, reports shouldn't be impacted. Why even waste your time breathing on it? It's going to be fine. Has anybody ever been in that meeting? And then it all breaks, right? But if we visualize it, we make these links that people can go to. We talk about it. They're shared. People are saying, so one company I worked with, the recipes, we made recipes for how to install the SharePoint plugin for the software. There was a major change to the software, and I called tech support, and I was like, how do I do this again? Because I think that our documentations are not sufficient. The tech support people told me, Matt, we use the QA recipes for how to install that thing. Like, we just use your documentation. That was success. People outside of our group knew what we were doing and relying on what we were doing. Same thing with the who owns what, that coverage map. Then people look at that and there's a shared responsibility for it. So then why did this get through? Instead of what they totally forgot, they were the ones that told you not to test it, right? Instead, it's, yep, we identified that risk. We gave it a priority. It's on the priority sheet. It's below the cut line. It wasn't tested. So the organization made a mature decision of risk management that was transparent on how far to go, how deep to go on testing. The conversation is entirely different if you've done that work. Because instead of like, well, you need to do a better job, it's like, well, maybe we need to bring you in earlier to help figure out what the priorities should be. Maybe we need to add some more resources so that you can go deeper. Maybe we need to give you more time. And you go, okay, boss. I mean, if you say so, and all of a sudden you got what you always wanted, didn't even have to ask for it. And it's someone else's a priority. It's on someone else's goal sheet for the year.
Yeah.
I think that's I don't know that there's been a comprehensive description of how to get there. And someone challenged us, like we'd hang out at conferences and tell people how to do it. And more than one person challenged us to make a training class. We used to do a 1-day training class, lean software testing. Well, now coronavirus happened and nobody can go to conferences anymore. And what if they don't have the money? Well, we wrote the book and we're pretty darn proud of it. The next step is, can you use these ideas? Did they work for you? Tell us about it so we can make it better. And that's what we're hoping to get to. So.
Awesome. Well, Matt Heusser, Michael Larsen, you guys are down to earth, practical, approachable, available on LinkedIn. So I encourage everybody to get the book and test it, try it, and give the feedback. But thanks
Yes,
for being my
please.
guest, guys. Fantastic, great discussions. We got a lot of deep topics that we covered. So, Joe, final thoughts to take us out?
Oh, I thought it was a great discussion. Absolutely. And there's so many things I took away from it. I'll point out a couple of them. And getting back to a couple of the points, but I really honestly am a believer that software testing simplifies the software testing experience for our users. It makes it work. And we're really doing a service to the community in that sense, because we're weeding out the bugs and we're making it super great. Michael, you made a couple of good points I really agree with. That early testing or early strategy meetings is when software testing really begins. And I believe in that, because if we can get involved in the early planning stages, we're helping to boil down the steps. I started out as a software interface designer. And so when I could say too many steps, let's boil this down and make it simple for the user, it went a long way. And there's one other thing that always comes up with John, but and it's something that I love to emphasize, and it's the term good enough software. And I want everybody to embrace the emphasis on good. It's not good enough, it's good enough. Is it good enough to get the job done? And I think that's a big distinction. People sometimes misinterpret that. And it's something we all have to embrace as a community, man. And I really, really appreciate everybody being a part of this. And we have to do our part to make software good enough and get involved in that process. The last little point I want to make before I turn it over is that I passed over at the beginning, but I want us all to give a great deal of appreciation and thanks to all of the work that John and Shelley Dillon do into coordinating these meetings. And Shelley does a lot of work to get the group together and to make the phone calls and everything, and she deserves a great deal of thanks for that. And thank you both, and everybody else who participates in this, and I appreciate it. That's
Awesome.
all, man. And thank you everybody for joining.
You.
I hope that you continue to be part of this community and build it into a community, not just a lecture thing, but a chance for us all to become friends and, use each other as contacts.
Super cool. Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody. Thanks for joining.
And Michael, by the way, you have almost as many guitars as I do.